So we've got two panelists that are going to kick off the talks for us. There's Dr. Errol Francis and Dr. Cheryl Finley. Dr. Errol Francis is the CEO of Culturand. Culturand provides work-based experience programs for those entering the sector. He has substantial experience in community engagement around mental health and the arts, and works with minority groups. Program manager at the Department of Health Race for Health program. Errol was awarded his PhD from the Slade School of Fine Art, University College London, where his research focused on post-colonial artistic responses to museums. And then we have Dr. Cheryl Findlay, who's an art historian, author, curator, contemporary art critic, a professor at Cornell University, and director of the AUC Collective for the study of art history and curatorial studies. She holds a PhD in African American Studies and History of Art from Yale University, with nearly 20 years of award-winning research on historic and contemporary images of the transatlantic slave trade. Some of her key work includes her book, Committed to Memory, The Art of the Slave Ship Icon. So without further ado, if we're ready, I'm gonna hand over to our first speaker, Dr. Errol Francis.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for asking me to make this presentation. I believe I've got 15 minutes or thereabouts, and I'm going to give you a basically edited account of a paper that I wrote after the Black Lives Matter protest and the movement kicked off in the summer. And the title of it is called Breathing Epistemic Violence and Decolonizing UK Heritage. And the reason why I'm giving it these titles, I will explain these terms actually before I get into it, is because what inspired me to write this was because of the statements of solidarity that we heard from various museums and arts organizations in the summer. And I found these statements quite disturbing. I also found, and the reason why I'm making reference to breathing is that the George Floyd event, the tragedy in Minneapolis, I also found deeply traumatic. And the reason why even now I haven't been able to watch the film or the video about it is because as Ellie said, I used to work in mental health, and I dealt with a number of cases of Black men who died at the hands of the police or in psychiatric hospitals. And the way that they died was very, very similar to what happened to George Floyd. And one of the cases, the last case that I dealt with, was a young man called Rocky Bennett. And he, to cut a long story short, he was involved in a scuffle with nurses, and he was held down for 21 minutes and he suffocated and died. So this brought back really painful memories for me. And it made me think, I had to ask myself a question: what have museums got to do with violence? Because it seemed to me that there was a disconnect in those statements that were made. It was as if they were talking about other people, other things, but not about what they are doing or what their connection with violence could be. So it made me think about different types of violence, actual violence, what happened to George Floyd, but also what I would call epistemic violence. Now, this isn't my phrase. This is a phrase from a post-colonial writer called Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. And she wrote an essay quite a long time ago now called Can the Subaltern Speak? And she proposes epistemic violence as something that happens as part of colonial domination, if you like, about the way we think. And episteme is a system of thought. And what she talks about is the way that systems of thought or knowledge, how they erase or forget or silence the Black experience, or the experience of colonialism or of oppression. And this absence, if you like, of addressing historical facts, she says it's a type of othering, actually. And this othering is a type of violence, epistemic violence. So what I wanted to consider, to answer my question, what have museums got to do with violence? I wanted to keep in my mind this idea of not only suffocation, but the idea of committing murderous acts of violence. What on earth has this got to do with museums? Because it seemed to me there was a disconnect. So in order to answer the question, I looked at just two objects in two different museums. So one of them was the Benin bronzes. And now those colleagues of trainees from the new museum school will remember this, because we all went together to the British Museum at the start of the course and saw these objects. And they are extraordinary. I mean, they really are. They are some of the finest examples of metal casting in the world. And if you're into sculpture, these are marvelous. And they were described in early 20th century, that this was by a European writer, saying that they stand amongst the highest achievements of metal casting, and that even Benvenuto Cellini, the Renaissance sculptor, they said he could not have done better himself. And what is also poignant about these objects is that they come from the Kingdom of Benin in Nigeria, and what is now Nigeria. And in the Edo language, the verb sayama means to remember, but its literal translation is to cast a motif in bronze. So this is how important these objects are, these bronze objects. So every time a Benin king came to the throne, sculptures in bronze and ivory were made in for his father's memorial altar. Now, the Kingdom of Benin was a proud culture that had been in contact with Europe from the end of the 14th century, and it traded in rich commodities. And the kingdom was ruled by a monarch, the Oba. And in the late 19th century, the British tried to enforce a trade agreement, a treaty with the Kingdom of Benin. The king refused. He said he wanted tariffs. The British should pay tariffs to trade with it. Well, of course, the British said, we're not having that. You know, we're the British. You can't do that. We're going to force you to do it. And they sent in a military campaign to force the kingdom into submission. This first mission was attacked and ambushed by the Africans and was almost completely annihilated. And in revenge, what was called the Benin Punitive Expedition was launched under Rear Admiral Harry Rawson in 1897. And they had an explicit mission, which was to completely destroy Benin City and to take the Oba, the king, capture him and put him into exile, because they wanted access to ivory, rubber, and palm oil, right? And when this expedition was launched in January 1897, it was one of the most appalling acts of violence that you could think of, actually. They completely destroyed Benin City. Many fine architectural works, which we would now have to remember this culture, were totally destroyed. And every movable piece of cultural heritage was taken by the British, and they took these things back to Europe, to London. They were sold to pay for the violence that they'd committed. They actually sold these on the open market, and what remained was distributed to a number of museums in the UK. and as I said, in Europe. Now, when you go to the British Museum and look at these objects, you cannot get a sense of this dreadful, appalling violence that was used to get these objects. That's one thing, but this is where we get back to the epistemic violence. The rather sanitized description that you see on the plaque in the museum is awful, actually, to read, in the sense that it's so matter of fact. Oh, we acquired, they do acknowledge they acquired these objects under colonial rule, but the full extent of this terrible act of appalling genocidal violence is not described, acknowledged, or and in any way referred to. So this is an example here of what I would say is this kind of double bind, if you like, of actual physical violence being perpetrated, and then a complete failure or sanitization of it in the curating, interpretation, and historical reference to it. The second object that I looked at to get this idea of the complicity of museums with violence was a tunic that was in another museum in Oxford. It's a very colourful garment. It's called a jibba, and it is a garment that would have been worn by a Sufi warrior in the late 19th century. And when you look at it, you realise there's a bullet hole in it, a bullet hole in where the heart was. So the person must have died who wore this, and you can get an idea that the person must have died, because when I read the account of the battle where this object originated, it talked about how the bodies of the dead Sudanese were looted, objects taken from them by the British. And so in the description of this object, it says that it was donated by somebody. It doesn't talk about the circumstances of the donation, but when you read about this uprising, you think, well, actually, nobody would have actually parted with this garment from the actual soldier. It must have been taken from a dead soldier. So you get this ethical issue about displaying an object which is kind of a trophy of war, as well as the very cursory description of the provenance. And again, when you go back into the particular battle that this object referred to, the Omdurman battle of 1898, 11,000 Sudanese were killed, as compared to 140 British soldiers. So it was a massacre, if you like. And again, you get this sense of a double level of violence, the actual violence perpetrated in the late 19th century, and then that violence that Spivak talks about, which is the complete absence or erasure or forgetting of what has taken place in terms of the interpretation. So my time's nearly up. Those are the examples I wanted to give of a real problem with this whole issue of violence that's been brought up. You know, museums actually thinking that they have no connection with the appalling things that happened in Minneapolis, when in fact they do have a connection with it. And then the double bind, which is a failure to curatorially acknowledge this. And it was because of all of this that we produced our charter for the heritage sector at Culture Ad, with the involvement of the trainees, which was set out a series of demands around the workforce, about interpretation, about the repatriation of objects, and so on. Because I think that this hypocrisy that we saw on a really spectacular scale, I still can't get my head around it. Why an institution which knows that it has objects obtained through such terrible means would make a statement about Black Lives Matter without acknowledging or even saying how it was going to deal with its own historical past. I think my time is up, but I'm happy to answer questions about that. But that's my basic point about the theme for the seminar.
Thank you so much, Dr. Errol. You actually had about a minute, not too long. Yeah, so well done. We're gonna, anybody who's got any questions would have put them to Moppy, and then we'll come back once people have gone to the breakout rooms. We're next gonna go to Dr. Cheryl Findlay.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Good afternoon. Can I get a good afternoon back?
Well, everyone's on mute, but you can get a good afternoon back from me.
All right, thank you so much. My apologies for joining late. I have. I just wanted to ask if I have the ability to share my screen, and I might just need 1 moment to move an image around.
Let me check with the team. Yeah, you do.
Yeah, okay, so just give me one sec, please. I'm coming from another conversation, so apologies for not having this as ready as I'd like for it to be for you. Okay. So. Thank you for your patience.
That's okay. Hopefully everyone's still thinking back to the points that Errol was making, is putting their questions in. Okay, brilliant, we're ready.
Okay. Just trying to line everything up here. Okay, hopefully that's all right. Good afternoon. So what I'd like to do with my, could you remind me how much time I have? Is it 15, 20 minutes?
15.
15, thank you. Okay, so I'll try to get through these in 15 minutes. So I wanted to get at our topic for the day by sharing with you the work that I've been doing over the past 2 years at the Atlanta University Center. I'm the director of the AUC Art Collective. We're a brand new program just in our 2nd year of operation, where we're really in the midst of, and I think it's just kind of, what would we call it, something that we were not expecting at all. But in the midst of really trying to tackle these big questions about how we might decolonize the museum, questions about the issues raised with regards to protests that are continually going on now regarding the placements of monuments and also the role of museums in our world. We're a program that's situated at the Atlanta University Center, which is the largest nexus of HBCU colleges and university, comprising Clark Atlanta University, Spelman College, and Morehouse College. And I wanted to take the moments that I have now to share with you what our program does, but also to give some examples in my teaching that show how we're looking at these issues and some of the questions that our students are asking. So in moving forward, just to share with you about our program, we are a program in art history and curatorial studies. We also have an early college program for high school students, 11th and 12th graders, that serves as a pipeline program to bring students to enroll in our institutions. And we're the only program of its kind in the nation that's really working to try to create a space for and to educate African American and African diasporic students to enter in and really change the world as we know it, as it relates to museums, but also the collecting of art and also the valuation and exhibition of art in and around the world. We are, as I said, having 3 different institutions, Clark Atlanta, Morehouse, and Spelman, known individually for all different kinds of really great accolades, but I'll highlight that at Clark Atlanta, we have work by Hale Woodruff and many other luminaries of African and African American art, but especially his Art of the Negro series, which is a beautiful mural in the museum. And he was one of the people who really helped to spearhead an art history program as well as a fine arts program at Atlanta University together with Nancy Elizabeth Prophet. At Morehouse College, we have the collection of the Martin Luther King Jr. Collection, which includes a number of different objects. And of course, that would have been his alma mater. And then at Spelman, we have a museum that is specifically designed with a mission to show only work by women of the African diaspora. And again, to think about ways that we can dismantle white supremacy, but also decolonize the museum, is to kind of think about not only the kinds of objects that we collect, but also the kinds of exhibitions that we're committed to having. And just to give you a quick timeline, and you can read this as I share with you, but we're really, really proud of our collections and the rich legacy of African American art history at the Atlanta University Center. One could really begin in 1865 with the founding of Atlanta University, but we often begin our timeline with W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1900 goes to Paris and at the Paris Exposition mounts an exhibition of photographs of African Americans to really state the claim that we are human too, in the face of, in 1900, a Paris exhibition that is a universal exhibition, wherein at the very same time as Du Bois's show, which has demographics and statistics to back up many of the advances that African Americans had made since the end of slavery in just 35 years before, what he's able to do is show this work, but at the same time, there's this really, really uncomfortable contradiction in that at this exposition, there were also human beings of African descent on display at the Paris Exposition. I mentioned before the work of Hale Woodruff that was instrumental in founding the art department along with Nancy Elizabeth Prophet at Spelman and at Atlanta University. But one of the things that they're also really well known for is spearheading the Atlanta University Annuals, which brought in works by African American artists in a juried competition and also helped to build a collection of over 1,200 objects that we use still to this day to teach from. And in moving forward and thinking about the kinds of things that, our students are interested in, and I think this would help us to answer questions about, what can we do, and what are students who are enrolled on the undergraduate level thinking about what they can do to really change the world in which they live, in which their children will live, and in which they work. They talk about wishing to, for example, become an archivist, to think about how they can do cutting edge curatorial work, and so on. And there are ways that in our program we include things like career development. I mentioned earlier the early college program, but global field study, enabling our students to, when the pandemic is over one day, we hope very soon, to have the opportunity to see the collections, the rich collections, not only in and around our own city, but also globally, as a way to think about the work that they might be interested in doing going forward. And so I want to take a moment just to give you a bit of a review of the kinds of things that we're looking at in terms of our curriculum, and thinking about, again, how do we decolonize? It's maybe thinking about the kinds of courses that we teach. And this is just a list of some of our foundational art history courses, and ones that are not, I want to say, in the sort of Western tradition of thinking about how art history as a discipline has really been formed over the past several hundred years. So we center African American art, we center African art, we center courses that really help us to think about, what is the state of the museum, what is the state of the field of curatorial studies, and also riffing off of, for example, contemporary artists like Fred Wilson. We have a course entitled Mining the Museum. We have courses too where we are in the process now of actually revamping our offerings that we have for not only art history majors, but also curatorial studies minors. And so in terms of thinking about how can we reshape what we teach our students, and what we do with our students in the face of the kind of upheaval that is before us right now. I think that many of us here on the Zoom, many of us who've been teaching for a long time or working in and around museums have been in the practice of really trying to do decolonial work. And so we have a new course that'll be on the books next year called Decolonizing the Museum. We also think that it's important to teach, for example, courses like Slavery and Visual Culture that help us to really look at some of our institutions, whether it's a major museum in Los Angeles or Atlanta or New York, and also looking at the boards of directors and people who are very responsible for the fiduciary elements of a museum. How can we examine these boards to see what their connections might be in order to think about how these boards themselves need to be shaken up in terms of who would actually serve on the board and what their political and financial allegiances may be. Another course that we're really interested in sharing with our students that I think will go a long way in helping us to think about how museums can be different, how these spaces can be different, is a course on the art market, making sure that students really understand as curators, as museum directors, as art historians, or as people who really want to really rethink what a museal space might be, or even how we value works of art. If they have a knowledge of how the art market functions and how it works, this is one of the ways that they could actually be able to use this material to go out and do the kind of work that we know that they're going to do. And just to give you an example, these are some of the courses here where we are really trying to highlight ways that students can make a difference by thinking about, say, for example, art and social movements, a course that's exposing undergraduate students in their first year to the notion of a history of social movements and how visual art has been at the forefront of really trying to, in many ways, put a face on what a social movement might look like. And I want to quickly, with a few minutes that remain, just talk about some of the courses that we have to offer. And one example is a course called the Black Arts Movement that looks at the period from about the early to mid 1960s through about the mid 1970s. a movement that aligns itself with sort of the end of the civil rights movement and the blossoming of the Black Power movement of the late 1960s through the early 1970s. And we begin this course by thinking at the ways in which Black artists and intellectuals begin to make their own publications. So if we look at the example of the graphic artist Aaron Douglas and his cover for Fire, which is devoted, as you see, to younger Negro artists from 1925, or the cover of the Survey Graphic magazine, which is a magazine that was really influential in terms of setting out the idea of not only the new Negro, but also the Harlem Renaissance with the editor Alain Locke, and the kinds of contributions that would have been in a journal such as this. We move forward to the period of the 1960s to see how people like Amiri Baraka and Larry Neal continue to do the kind of work that students as early as the 1920s would have done in creating a volume that includes a number of different influential and important writings by people like Baraka and Neal, Sanchez, and others, including poetry as well. We also look at the way site specificity can play a role in decolonizing the museum and really thinking outside of the white cube, outside of the museal space, outside of museums that have to hold collections, often collections, as we've heard earlier, that have come from colonial plunder and illegally through especially racist and violent acts. And so in looking at an example like this of the Wall of Respect, which was at the very beginning of the mural movement in cities around the country in the 1960s, including Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and Washington, you see a collaborative of artists working with the Organization of Black American Culture to put together a mural that really tries to highlight African American and African heroes and also Black history, but it's also a place that becomes activated by poets like Gwendolyn Brooks, or dancers, or even people working in theater, as productions were using this Wall of Respect as a backdrop for many of their productions during the time that it was up. We also look globally at figures like Stokely Carmichael, also known as Kwame Ture, as he travels around the world outside of the United States to the Caribbean and to the continent of Africa to talk about Black Power. And this is an example, a really, really wonderful image from Horace Ove of Stokely Carmichael addressing the Black Power Conference in London in 1968. So these are the kinds of images that we show, but we really try to think about the internationalization of Black Power and the internationalization of certain kinds of ideas and histories as we're looking at this period of the Black arts movement, even through the work of an artist such as Elizabeth Catlett. This is her Black Unity from 1968, or other works by the artist, including her Negro es Bello, Black is Beautiful from the same period, or other images like this one on the right, Political Prisoner, referring, of course, to the case of Dr. Angela Davis. The Black arts movement, of course, featured very prominently the Black Panther Party, and we teach the Black Panther Party, and especially the idea of thinking about how many of our leaders, whether they are working as information officers, as Kathleen Cleaver would have done, or whether they are really trying to internationalize and think about, a global way in which we can teach art history, but also the global ramifications of Black liberation struggles. And I think, again, one of our answers to the question at hand is really looking at the global implications of this type of, I would call it a liberation struggle, that is the one that's before us, to decolonize the museum and to really think about, anti-racist tactics to dismantle white supremacy. And again, the example of Angela Davis and the international support that she received in the 1970s would probably support that as well. One of the last images I want to leave you with here, and again, this is thinking about collections and how we might examine collections, is an image, a still from Fred Wilson's very important and influential exhibition, Minding the Museum, This is called Metalwork. It's an image, just an exhibition installation still from 1992. And this is an exhibition that takes place at the Maryland Historical Society in 1991-92. Wilson, who formerly had been in museum education at the Whitney, was invited to do a curatorial intervention, to go into their collections and to come up with an exhibition. And he ends up with the show Minding the Museum, where he juxtaposes some of the objects that he finds in the collection at the Maryland Historical Society, including a set of shackles that were used to constrain violently and enslave an African-American person. But he also found, of course, this lovely silver service that would have dated from around the very same time. And he set up in this exhibition, which is one that is taught, and you're probably all familiar with it, in curatorial studies, in museum studies. He set up juxtapositions between things like metalwork, and this would be the example here, or woodwork, where he finds a whipping post and then juxtaposes that with furniture that would be used in sort of a material culture study room. And so exhibitions like this and sort of decolonial work like Fred Wilson's, I would posit, is one of the ways that we can continue to really think about how museums need to be held accountable, especially with regards to their exhibitions and installations. And I think the last image I'll show, and I hope I haven't gone over too much, is an image from the Doc Hart Biennial in 2004, where I co-curated an exhibition with my colleague at Cornell, Dr. Salah Hassan, called 3x3, 3 Artists, 3 Projects. And this was a show wherein we invited David Hammonds, the conceptual artist, Maria Magdalena Campos Pons, and Pamela Z, a sound artist. Campos Pons is an installation artist originally from Cuba. And in this example that I'm showing you here, it's an example of the work of David Hammonds. It was a sheep raffle that he chose to do for his part of the exhibition. And this was a time-based work that was only up for 6 days. And I'm showing this just to also say that in terms of, thinking about this problem of museums and museum spaces, again, I'm a big proponent of site specificity and also time-based media, and thinking about how we as educators, as curators, as perhaps those affiliated with museums, as students, might want to, go back to basics and think about the ways that site specificity can be used, also to think about the ways that we might look to the continent of Africa and other sites that are not centered in this larger conversation about museums and the place of museums, and to think about the way that contemporary exhibitions like a Doc Hart or other biennials that are happening on the continent might be places where we might find solace and also learn something new. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant. We've got a bit more time, so I'm gonna ask if Dr. Errol has anything that he would like to elaborate on from his talk, and then we'll sort of go between, and then we'll release the participants into the breakout spaces about 5:50.
Yeah, right. Well, thank you. Yeah, not a lot to add. I did sort of cut myself. No, I do. I have one example, yes, because I cut this from my talk, which was an example of where a museum has addressed this problematic that I was describing about violence, but where they've addressed it in the present tense, and not just in relation to the part, not just using heritage. There's a wonderful essay by Stuart Hall called Whose Heritage? It's got a long title, Unsettling the nation or the, anyway, whose heritage? Look for that. And he talks about the way that heritage is always involved with the past and with preserving things and conserving things. And going back to this image of breathing and suffocation, what I found amazing about this particular incident was a case of where a museum had addressed the issue about violence and in particular suffocation, and but done it via contemporary art, right? So it's the Wellcome collection, and they acquired a work called Restrained in 2019. It's a moving image work by a Bristol-based artist called Kat Anderson, K-A-T Anderson. And it's basically, and this is going back to what I was saying to you about my experience working in the psychiatric sector. This struck a chord with me because it's about the killing of a Black man in a psychiatric hospital at the hands of nurses. So it's very disturbing, actually, who are trying to violently restrain him. And what takes place is very similar to what happened to George Floyd. You see this man who appears to pose no threat, and he's subjected to overwhelming force, and we witness the life draining from his body. But it actually has hope, this thing, because this man actually comes back to life, as it were, in the film, and we almost get a replay of what was missing, really, which was the love and compassion of his own community and his family, and you see him re-establishing that connection. So there's redemption at the end of it. It's as I said, disturbing but beautifully made piece of work, very emotional in the way that it tackles something, well, the loss of life in an environment where we would expect care to be taking place. Now, I think this was extraordinary to come across this, actually, in a year when we've been talking about multiple suffocations. The thing about what happened with George Floyd was the fact that so many Black men had uttered exactly the same words, "I can't breathe." Now, this is an example of an artwork that tackles this, but it tackles it in the recent past. And I wanted to cite this as a way that music, just as we've just heard about Fred Wilson's interventions, that when you put contemporary artists into museums, they will do things or make connections that are different to what academic curators will do. So it was this example of an artwork that tackles violence that I wanted to bring up, but also I wanted to reference a statement by Theodore Adorno, the philosopher, who talks about museums being sepulchres for dead works of art. You know, there is this kind of mortifying aspect to the way that a traditional museum wants to embalm and preserve objects, stop them from decaying, you know. And I think what this artwork does is that it does breathe, although it's dealing with a tragic thing, because it's very much in the present. The artist is still alive. The work, being a video work, actually engages with the audience in a different way to the usual type of museum object. So that was my final example, which was meant to be a positive one. Thank you.
Thank you, that's really interesting. So just to build on that, I think you've both touched on contemporary art and its connection to collections and how it can help people either work through trauma or speak about the collections differently. I'm just going to go into one question before people leave. How can we bring that sort of energy, like Errol, you were just saying about breathing new life into a collection and not talking about it like dead works? How can we bring that into the heritage sector for people who aren't artists, but they're curators?
Sorry, were you addressing?
You first and then Dr. Finley.
You know, I really thank I'm really thankful for that, reminding us about Fred Wilson, because in a way, I think what Fred Wilson's work shows us, although he's working as a kind of conceptual artist in a way, is a possible curatorial strategy in itself. Because by rearranging objects, by juxtaposing things, not in the usual way that museums want to classify, you know, so we have silverware, right? In the silverware department, then we have the department to do with slavery, you know. If you start bringing these objects together, it really does expose something about classification of objects and curatorial strategies. And I think it's a message to how curators, who, you know, not just artists, could work with collections. Because I think one of the problems, and Stuart Hall talks about this in his essay, is taxonomy. You know, the grouping of things into classes is a way of controlling discourse. And if we can disrupt that taxonomy, which is what Fred Wilson does, it opens up a whole new way of reading objects. And I think it's a strategy that curators can use as well as artists like Fred Wilson.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Errol. If Dr. Cheryl can go, and we've got 2 minutes before we go into breakout rooms. So. Oh, you're still on mute.
Would you please repeat the question, Ellie?
Absolutely. So you've both touched on contemporary art and how that breathes new life into collections and how they get to speak about it differently. I was just wondering in what ways you both thought that could be brought into curatorial practice as a standard.
How contemporary art, I'm sorry, can be
how they respond to the collections. How that sort of thinking around collections can be brought in.
Yeah, I think that it's already very much a part of, at least in my experience, it's already very much a part of curatorial practice. So another example is Kara Walker's exhibition at the Met, I think it was in 2007, Deluge, wherein she created a body of works in response to their historic collections. And it just so happened to, you know, coincide with, falling. So the exhibition had already been in the works, even though I think it was really highlighted because it was shortly after the catastrophe of Hurricane Katrina. And again, the title was Deluge, and I believe the date is 2007, although I might have that slightly wrong. It might have been a couple of years before that. But I think that in terms of the work that curators are doing, in terms of the work that contemporary artists are doing, that there are so many examples. Fred Wilson is just one of them, but there's so many examples of artists that have really done what I would call is a symbolic possession of the past. That is, they go into collections, they go into the archive, and they resurrect images and objects and histories and narratives from the archive and incorporate it into their works. Hank Willis Thomas is a really, really great example of a contemporary artist who has been doing that work for forever, beginning with his thesis exhibition in 2003, 2004 at the California College of the Arts in Oakland, wherein he hired advertising kiosks into which he placed images from his Branded series, which is a series that he began by looking at historical images like the brand, for example, on Black bodies through slavery and the slave trade. And he also looked at how, for example, alcohol companies, tobacco companies, excessively market to Black communities and especially to Black men. How, of course, we can look at the sports industry. I mean, that's like a whole nother, industry and conversation to have with regards to decolonizing and ownership. But in this series of works, in the advertising kiosks just outside of, and again, you'll probably notice many of the references that I've had for you today are references that are outside of the white cube, outside of the sepulchral museal space, right? And in these advertising kiosks, he includes an image called Branded Chest, wherein it's a digitally manipulated image where he had one of his classmates pose, and he has the Nike brand on his chest. Again, thinking about the relationship between ownership in, in different kinds of sporting events. He also had an image that he riffed off of the Absolute Vodka campaign and inserted the historical abolitionist image of description of the slave ship inside of this bottle and called it Absolute Power. So these are some of the ways that the contemporary artists are really going back to the archives and really thinking about whether they're archives that you might find, say, in a historical society or associated with a university or another institute of higher learning, or whether they're archives that are in the museum themselves. I think that artists have been doing this as a practice for some time, and definitely since even before the work of Fred Wilson, and many artists are invited to do this kind of work. I think the last example that I would share with you, which is a different example, so it might be somewhat of a pivot, is James Luna's Artifact piece from I think it's 1987, it's like the late 1980s, wherein he takes himself, as a Native person, and inserts himself inside of a vitrine and puts this in a museum, as if he were in a natural history museum as an artifact himself, wearing only a loincloth. So to really think about, on the one hand, we can talk about the archives and the collections and how artists are disrupting those and reimagining those. We can even look at Fred Wilson's Guarded View, where he has, this installation of headless mannequins, brown skin headless mannequins wearing the uniforms of major museum guards of New York City in the early 1990s. But I think the Luna piece really takes the conversation slightly in a different direction by putting oneself as an object into the museum space. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so we're now going to go into our breakout rooms. I hope that you take all of that brilliant information with you. So first gonna let go room 1. And then room 2. Room 3. Room 4. Room 5. And lastly, room 6. Brilliant. Okay, so we're going to continue the conversation here with Dr. Cheryl and Dr. Francis. So yeah, we can go into a bit more depth.
Hi.
Hello. So I just wanted to, so they're going to be feeding us in some questions that might be coming in from the live chat on YouTube and from the breakout rooms. But I just wanted to ask you a few things. I'll just start with just the one, and then either of you feel free to handle this one. So Dr. Errol, your work, as I saw it, was more focused on the looted civilization and wealth of Africa, both tangible and intangible heritage. And then Dr. Francis, I noticed that your work was more about the sort of middle passage and that phrase that you coined, the slave, what was it? The slave ship icon. So you both come at it from the mainland, and as she was saying, Dr. Cheryl, earlier, about Africa not being centered all the time, and the middle passage. So in terms of the sector and what we're trying to do for solutions, how can the sector speak more authentically about how the language of interpretation, it sometimes embodies white supremacy and white fragility?
Sorry, Ellie, could you repeat that again? Sorry.
Well, I absolutely can. So what I really wanted to get from the two of you was your opinion on how the sector can speak, or how would you imagine the sector can speak authentically about the language of interpretation. So like you were saying with the British Museum, the labels just didn't do justice, and how that is part of white supremacy and white fragility in not wanting to give it too much context, and wanting to sort of over-sanitize.
Okay. Shall I
Sorry.
go?
Oh, do you mind if I start?
Cheryl, you go, yeah.
Or do you want to start?
No, fine. I think
Be very polite.
Okay. So I just want to apologize, Dr. Francis. I was coming from another presentation, so I'm sorry I missed the beginning of your.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll give a couple of examples. I mean, I think, you know, if we look at any, you know, any museum that has, you know, just about any museum that has examples of African art, African artifacts, objects, again, that were most likely not in any way acquired legitimately in their collections, there's never enough information. If we talk about, you know, the tombstone, that is, you know, the information that we would see next to a work of art, you don't get to know who the maker was. You don't know the culture sometimes. You just might get a sort of description. So this is the type of thing that I would say really has to be, you know, reimagined in terms of how we value what these categories of knowing are. You know, how do we value the categories of knowing? And also, I would say, too, that another example might be we were with a group of students at another institution looking at an exhibition, and we looked at, again, the tombstones, and it just had, I think in these examples, it had maybe the name of the artist, the work of art, maybe the medium and the year, and that was it, nothing more. And these are works of art that would have been made, say, you know, between 1865 and the present. And one of our students asked, well, where are the accession numbers? Why, how come we don't see accession numbers here? And this was at an institution that is a foundational institution where it relates to the teaching and collecting of African American art and African art. But it's also an institution that's not as heavily resourced. So that type of information wasn't there. And I'm not going to say that it doesn't matter. It probably matters in some scheme of things, but I think that really a reevaluation of what, you know, what those categories are, what we privilege and what we don't privilege is something that needs to be done. I also think that too, that, you know, sometimes in the face of not having that kind of information, that, you know, that we really have to think about how we can use other sources, whether they are archival sources that relate to oral histories and other histories, to be able to try to interpret those images or objects. One last example that I'll give is the work of Dr. Richard J. Powell. He's a brilliant and amazing art historian at Duke University, who's written, you know, many books on the work of William H. Johnson and others. He did a really important study with Jock Reynolds at the Yale University Art Gallery to conserve a legacy, looking at and really working on actually restoring through art conservation works of art by Black artists in collections around the country. But anyway, he was lauded at the College Art Association, our professional organization. I can't remember how many years ago it was, but let's say it was like about 4 or 5 years ago, 4 years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And as part of this, he has to give a talk, right? And he gets up and he gives this masterful lecture about Henry Ossawa Tanner. You know, Henry Ossawa Tanner being, you know, one of the, you know, the deans of African American painting, who, comes from Philadelphia, studies in Philadelphia, and then, ultimately goes to Europe, settles in Paris, travels in North Africa, and actually lives the rest of his life in Paris until the mid 1930s. But anyway, this lecture that Rick Powell gave was a lecture wherein he was describing and reading from these letters that were exchanged between Tanner and his father. Tanner trying to convince his father of how important it was for him to continue to do the work that he did, to stay in Paris, to study art, how important it was, and, the people that he would have met with while he was there. You can think of all the famous European modernists, etc. Anyway, all of these letters do not exist. They did not exist. This was something that Rick Powell, the art historian, fabricated. And so I'm suggesting this as a way to, sometimes you get to a certain point and you are searching and searching and searching and searching, and you're never going to find it. It's not there anymore. Maybe it was never there. And so I think sometimes it's really about creating our own narratives, really trying to reimagine, what those spaces are, what those narratives might be. And so this work that I'm referring to by Dr. Powell I think it's coming out like this fall. I think his book is coming out this fall, and I can't wait for it because it was a lot of fun. There were so many people in the room that really thought that these were real letters that Tanner wrote. I knew that they were not. I could tell because I could see a little wink in his eye, But anyway, sorry to go on to a lot.
No, that was very interesting about creating your own narrative, and we'll definitely be on the lookout for the book. So, Dr. Errol, did you have anything that you wanted to say in response?
Yeah, so what needs to change, yeah? And you were basically asking. So there's so many levels to that. Just one thing that I wanted to flag up about change was that it was this sort of moment, a eureka moment for me, which maybe a lot of people were already aware of, but I was not aware of this. And it was one day I went to a museum and they showed me some really uncool labels that had been written in there, but they were agonizing about how to change them because they said they'd been written by the founding curator who, like 100 years ago. And the light bulb that went on in my head at that moment was that museums don't just preserve or conserve objects, but they want to conserve the way they work, that is part of the conservation. And it just hadn't clicked with me before that this, that there's a whole cult of preservation of methodologies. And so, it was done this way. So, why should we change it? So the job of change, therefore, needs to go into not just, say, for example, research on objects and how should we describe an object in a more fuller way, but there are other pressures that we can bring to bear on interpretation and education and practices within the museum. And I think it's to do with related disciplines like, say, art history, cultural studies, history, even anthropology or related, the museum I was in was they call themselves anthropological, but my book is ethnographic, it's 19th century ethnography, right? But the pressure on the curatorial and the interpretation needs to have that academic weight as well. And so, just to give you some exciting news, it looks like we're going to get some funding for our postgraduate program, right? And this is the kind of thing, if we can get guys like you who've been through this to do original research so we can open up these new narratives and these new interpretations to bring that pressure onto the curatorial practice, that's one thing. But then you've got to change who's working in there as well, right? Because people write their own histories, they reflect their own, and I was in a seminar before this, right? And we were talking about empathy, and this was another slightly eureka moment for me, which was how if you don't have empathy for what I was just describing about the Benin, you know, I walked in there and my immediate response was, oh my God, they killed that guy and they took his tunic and put it in a museum. If you don't have empathy for that, how can you challenge it? And I think that what we've got, if you, in the middle of the Black Lives Matter campaign, I don't know if you heard this professor, David Starkey, he said, oh, the violence couldn't have been that bad because look how many of these African people are walking about. Now that's lack of empathy is on a heroic scale. So if you've got that kind of attitude, why would people engage with these hidden stories that we want to bring out? So I think there's a real thing about colonial lack of empathy that's still with us, right? And you can try and change people in there and make them more empathetic, or you can just put somebody in there who's got the life experience or the interest, who will think, oh my God, we need to explain that bullet hole in that. How did that bullet hole get in that garment, right? The other thing that I think is brought out very nicely by Cheryl's examples and is this thing about categories, right? And this is another thing that museums want to keep. So, for example, Egypt, right? I get really exercised about this, right? Which is you go into a museum and Egypt is described as a separate civilization from Africa, right? And you know, go to the British Museum, they describe Egypt as the ancient Near East, and Africa is downstairs in a different room. Well, that's a huge, what would you call it? It's political on a cultural level.
Right, and it's also, could I add to what you're saying, Dr. Francis, too? Yeah. It's also like, it's a perspective about like, where do you sit? Yeah. Where are you? Here I am, you know, on Wampanoag land in the state of Massachusetts in the United States. And, you know, most, I would say, Americans from here would, you know, make those same incorrect distinctions about Africa, right? They'll talk about Egypt, but they won't talk about West Africa. They won't talk about other parts of Northern Africa, right? Or they won't also talk about the GCC, you know, just to be able to kind of imagine one's, you know, global view as being just that and not have to be like we say the Middle East. You know, people who live in the GCC don't call themselves being from the Middle East, right? You know, so I agree with you, those categorizations. And you go to the museum, especially in an encyclopedic museum like the British Museum or the Metropolitan Museum, and it's really dumbfounding. The conversation I was having earlier was with a group of primarily curators at major American museums. And one of the questions, and it was about our program, was, well, you know, do you ever think about not teaching African American art? And that is a course that we offer, African American art, as a standalone. Have you ever thought about teaching that course as a course that would be integrated, you know, with a larger history of, say, American art or world art or what have you? And we said absolutely not, because for us, that's the foundational course, you know. And anyway, I feel like I'm going off on a tangent, but that's
it's absolutely relevant. All of these categories, I mean, even modernism, you know, you talk about modernism, is the Harlem Renaissance part of, is that an important thing to look at in terms of modernism, you see? So, you know,
of course it is.
Yeah,
of
course,
yeah.
Yes, of course. But, you know, when you teach a course on modernism, right? Which Black art movement would they, you know, include in that? So this whole thing about categories, and we had, going back to Egypt, there was a wonderful film on British TV the other day of an American professor. This is Henry Louis Gates, doing this very thing, talking about the Kush Empire and its relationship with Egypt, and really trying to integrate a cultural perspective of Africa that doesn't say that Egypt is a separate thing. Right. So yeah,
but also to say, it's, I mean, sorry, now I feel like we're like on the Egypt trip, but that yes, Egypt is a part of Africa, but Egypt is also a part of the GCC. You know, I mean, as you just like one of the things that I'm a huge fan of is the what we can learn from mapping. You know, from really mapping our mapping our minds, mapping our work, mapping our intellectual productivity, mapping our travels. And so if you just like zoom in on a map of that part of the world, you can see where everything is connected. And so that I think that, yes, it's so important to make sure that Egypt is not, a standalone country or continent, but I think it's also as important as it is to connect Egypt to the continent. I think it's also important to connect it to the other parts of the world that are nearby to it as well.
Yeah, those are geopolitical references. They're absolutely important. But the reason why I keep going on about it is because of the negative cultural message that these encyclopedic museums give to us as people of color, which is you don't come from anywhere that's connected with an ancient civilization, a proud, that is the damage that's done when they do that, of making these separations. So that whole project of Egyptology from the 18th century was precisely that. They couldn't connect this with Africa, so they created a whole separate body of knowledge and a whole separate history. So it's just one example, but we could go on. Oceania, whatever.
Well, I'm aware that we only have about 20 minutes, so that's really interesting. So,
Ellie, what time are we finishing? Because I just need to make sure that I may have another meeting that I have to jump off on.
Okay.
So I just want to make sure
that's
that I
okay.
can do this.
Well, this portion of the discussion will run for another 20 minutes-ish, and then they'll come back from the breakout rooms, and we're aiming to finish by 7. Yeah.
Okay. I can't stay.
7 equals what? Does that equal 2 o'clock for me?
I don't. Oh, okay. Let me just check.
Is that in 45 minutes? That's 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have to go in 15 minutes.
Okay. So if we focus, it'll just been confirmed that that's 2 p.m. for Cheryl. So really quickly, if we were to think about with what you said about how the categories try and sort of divorce people from feeling like they are connected to an ancient civilization and all of the sort of stuff, but coming at it from a solution-based perspective, how would you reimagine the sort of sector addressing these issues? I can break that down. I can break that down a little bit more if necessary.
I need to think. Dr. Cheryl, do you want to go?
I think I need to hear the question again because I was
I'll break that down a little bit more. Yeah. So if coming at it from a solution-based perspective, I heard a really great quote today, which is elements of our culture are appropriated and sold back to us with less than clever taglines. And then another person said, if the gatekeepers of Black art forms were to try and speak about the collection, then its full context, it would expose their knowledge gaps. So thinking about the sort of sector as a whole from both the American, the British, and also the African sort of context, if we're to reimagine like solutions, what would they look like to the both of you?
For museums or collections?
For museums and the whole thing.
Okay, so I don't mind starting. So, okay, how do I say it? All right. So let's say we kind of, I think we need to create a new and different value system. I think we need to imagine and also make space for other voices in positions of power and leadership. So from the director to the chairwoman of the board, to the members of the board, and to the curatorial staff, all the way through to art handling, education, and so on. So to really think about who those people are in those positions, and to be clear about, like, if you have a board, you can set term limits, right? There are ways that people can cycle off of boards. There are also ways that you can have a board of directors that doesn't say, okay, the only way you can be on this board is if you make over $1 million a year. Rather, there are often spaces on boards for intellectuals to serve. And I think that's another space that we should think about. And I think that the idea of collecting also has to change. The first question I would have for that would be, is there still a need to collect, right? If you have, and there are of course many museal spaces on the Kunsthalle format wherein you don't necessarily have collections that need to be tended to or cared for. And so with that, that's really the big question. Do you continue to collect? If so, what is your definition of what you collect? Do you then go into your collection and say, okay, we're going to deaccession this XYZ image or object in order to be able to acquire ABC that we really, really wanted that needs to fit in with our collections. I think another example too, I would have in someone like Agnes Gund, who has been the longtime chair of the board of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, who sold a work by Lichtenstein in 2016 to establish the Art for Justice Fund. So to really think about, if you are, someone who is a person in a position of power, or even if you are an institution and you have multiple Picassos or whatever the work is, that you might be able to think about a way to deaccession that work from your collection in order to, say, fund positions for people who you might say we don't really have room for these new staff members to work in areas that we know are lacking. I would also recommend a way to just kind of rethink. Again, we're talking about rethinking these categories. There's been a lot of controversy in the US and in New York around, the category of African art in scare quotes, right? And so there was an example about 2 years ago where the Brooklyn Museum had a search for a curator of African art, and all they could do was come up with someone who was not a person of African descent, right? And it was a big brouhaha, et cetera, et cetera. But again, I think it's really like reimagining those categories, because I think that's a category. I'm not going to say that African art doesn't exist. We know, of course, it does wholeheartedly, but that category in art history of African art is one that's born out of the colonial paradigm. So, how do we rethink that? And I look at the work of someone like the late, great Okwe, who was a champion of looking at, at African modernism, right? Yeah. Or my colleague Salah Hassan, who looks at the modernist moment, wherein, African nations are gaining their freedom from colonial rule. Leopold Sedar Senghor, the first president of Senegal, who himself is a poet and champion of the arts, and his really important and influential First World Festival of Negro Arts in 1966. So to really think about different models wherein, if I were to think about a category of African art, to me, it might begin instead, with African revolution, right, and decolonization, as opposed to beginning with colonial plunder. So
thank you so much.
Those are some thoughts that I have.
Yeah,
great. Yeah, I'm totally with Dr. Cheryl about a diverse workforce and audience. But I'm going to say something that's going to shock you, that I've come to regard objects in museums as the biggest problem, the objects themselves. Mm-hmm. And going back to what Dr. Cheryl was saying about questioning collecting, I've come to feel that collecting masses of things with no limit to the number or size or extent is the colonial mindset itself. I don't know if you've seen Citizen Kane, this film, Citizen Kane. It's rather...
like from a long time ago?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Orson Welles.
Yeah.
What really amazing about this film is that it was based on William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate, right? And I have visited his house in California, because it's a museum in San Simeon, California. And he was a crazy collector, right? He would go to Greece and buy a whole side of a temple and bring it to his house, and then make it into the place where people change for their, to go to the swimming pool. And then you would have like a medieval fireplace. He was a crazy collector. But the funny thing about Citizen Kane is that they make the collecting out to be pathological.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but it is pathological. It totally is.
Yeah. So at the end of the film, right, what they say in there, they try to find out his last words when he dies is Rosebud, right? And everybody's trying to find out what is Rosebud, and in the end, the object that Rosebud relates to has been destroyed. It's a sled that he had as a child, and he was adopted as a child, and they wouldn't let him take it to the adopted parents. But he remembers this thing, but it's the one thing that he doesn't have. It's not an object, right? It's a wonderful account of the baseness of objects, right, and collecting. So what I'm going to say is that I look forward to going to the British Museum when the Elgin marbles are gone and the room is empty.
Me too.
Yeah. Very controversial. Yeah.
So a museum with no objects, because then, it goes back to what Stuart Hall is saying in his essay. We then will have to engage with contemporary culture. We then have to engage with intangible heritage, not things that you can touch, buy, or hold, or preserve. And the original meaning of the word museum relates to this exchange of ideas. The Temple of the Muses, museum, right? Mm-hmm. It's later that the Europeans try to make this thing into a place for collecting loads of stuff, right?
Yeah.
But if you think of the museum as a space for cultural exchange, and the other reason why I'm suspicious of objects is that the Western culture has an obsession with looking at things. So they make you go into a museum and you have to look all the time. You can't listen to anything. You can't touch it. You can't taste it. You can't smell it, right? Mm. And that is base as well, because it's only one faculty that's being engaged, right?
Yeah.
And objects encourage us to do that. So I look forward to museum with no objects at all.
Well, I think also one example you make me think of too is, so we have the people that work in museums, the staff, right? And then we have the art or the objects. But then we also have the building.
Yeah.
And so, as I said, like much of my answer will be like, take it to the streets, make it site specific, put it in the community, give people art kits to make art, etc. Make it time-based, make it, something that's conceptual, that's not necessarily going to be sequestered. And I mean that word in its entirety, in this white cube space. But, you also made me think of, Dr. Francis too, this notion of the museum as temple, and the, at least in the last, I want to say, maybe since let's call it the 1970s, I guess, 1960s, 1970s, or maybe it's earlier than that. I can't remember when the Guggenheim Museum was built, but this notion, in New York. So like the 50s, right? So to think of this idea of this architect, right? This museum architect who becomes a star, and the space is devoid of objects. And I'll never forget when, oh God, now what's his name? I cannot remember his name. I'm sorry, I'm having a moment.
That's okay.
But the architect of the Jewish Museum in Berlin.
Daniel Liebeskind.
Yes, Liebeskind's museum. Yeah. All I wanted to do was to get there before the objects went in. Because that was a space of without the objects,
Yeah,
a
yeah,
space
yeah.
of feeling, of understanding, of you could channel, you know, what happened and what that history was through the architecture itself. And I don't know. I feel like I'm going off on a tangent that doesn't really make sense here, but I agree. I mean, I think also with regards to this, you know, compulsive and maniacal
Collecting, yeah.
collecting, that, you know, that what you end up with is so much stuff. You know, people are like, well, look, you bought my such and such in 1969, and how come I don't get to see it on the walls in an exhibition until 2015?
Yeah.
But you know,
So there's.
I just want to jump in and support what you've just said, which is, I went to the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and I can't remember a single object in there.
I know, it's just a bunch of junk. Yeah, yeah. I mean, sorry.
There was a room that they put me in, and the door was slammed, and I was in total darkness.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I remember.
Right.
Yeah, I remember that room as well.
Yeah, I remember that.
So is that a solution in, you guys might come aware that people are going to be coming back in 2 minutes, of heritage organizations and museums refocusing on people's other senses and not just coming to look at an object? That's really interesting. So I'm just going to close it with the last 2 minutes. So they're going to have to be really quick points. I'm aware that Dr. Francis, you've got to go. And thank you so much for your time.
Like in 1 minute. So I can't.
This is more of a comment from Anna Diney than a question. And she said, Dr. Francis, by hearing about the Sudanese shirt with the bullet hole, serves as an example of how the museum would signal to Black people that it's not a place for them without the museum even being aware that they are presenting this message. So, yeah, I think that's really interesting, the like silent messages that are being pumped out there.
Yeah. It is a subliminal, you don't even know you're getting the message, but you get it.
You're getting it.
Yeah.
Which is what I've always said is why many people on sometimes a conscious or unconscious basis don't really want to go into these spaces, because they know it's just reaffirming. So hopefully if we ever have a part 2, we'll discuss sort of ways that they can stop doing that. And
can I add something to what you're saying to that train of thought? So in the class I'm teaching right now, it's called Theory in Criticism and Exhibition Practice. And you know, we've been looking at the history of museums and collecting from literally the cabinet of curiosity, and we'll come to the present day. But one of the things that we were talking about in class yesterday was the University Museum. And we have at Atlanta University Center, we have this long history of the Atlanta University, or the Atlanta Annuals, right? This series of exhibitions that ran from 1942 to 1970s. They were juried, they brought in collections, et cetera, et cetera. But we were also talking about the place of the museum, and both the Clark Atlanta Museum and the Spelman Museum will celebrate their 25th anniversary in 2021. And one of the things that, you know, that one of the speakers was discussing yesterday in class was that, in fact, the museum at Atlanta University had always been, or works that were collected even during the annuals were collected by the university and sort of the library, or the university in another space. And that the exhibition space was not this sort of privileged, you know, separate white cube space. And I think that's also an issue when you talk about like feeling welcome. Hey, let's talk about that. It costs like, I don't know, you can't even take a family of 4 to the Guggenheim or the Met. It costs too much money. You know, so there's the admissions cost, but then there's also the actual physical space being so separate sometimes, I think, is incredibly off-putting. And so I was thinking, and I kind of posed this in class yesterday, you know, how different it was if you look at images of exhibitions, say from like the 19th century or earlier parts of the 20th century, even, you know, the mid 20th century, how there's kind of like the salon style of hanging things, how everything, you know, is sort of together. It's not, you know, Africa, whatever that means, over here, Greece over there, sculpture over here, you know, named gallery over there. And so I think that in terms of, awakening the senses, that if we were to reimagine museal spaces wherein you have, maybe it's a chronological slash thematic layering of ideas and images and objects, where you can have, the porcelain with the wood and the painting and the book and the treatise, all together, and where you might hear something of the period as well. That there might be an element, whether it's of music or sound or time-based media, and that there isn't this need to have to be quiet all the time. I mean, you know what I mean? I just think that it's when it's gotten to the space where it's the white cube and you can't touch things, you have to be quiet all the time. That's not a normal space to be in.
No, it's not. It's true. That's very interesting.
Yeah, this has been really exciting.
Thank you.
Lovely to have the conversation, Dr. Francis. Good to see you.
Thank you. Very stimulating. Yeah. Really great to meet you. Thank you.
Hope to meet you in the flesh.
Yes. One day we'll do this in person one day. Thank you so much.
Right,
thank you so much. If you have to leave,
I'm going to
leave. Thank you wholeheartily, for attending.
Stimulating discussion, and thank you for facilitating this transatlantic dialogue. Really does add something to it, actually. It's been really good.
Thank you.
It has.
All right then, Dr. Cheryl.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Dr. Cheryl, before people are sort of re-entering, there was one question for you from Dana. I think we've got like 1 or 2 minutes. And she says, about your course, do they include aspects of conservation in their courses, e.g. dialogue on including discussion with originating communities for treatment approaches?
So the answer is, in our symposium, yes. However, we don't, when we have conversations about objects and conservation and preservation, yes, we have those conversations. But as a matter of course, we don't really have a class on conservation right now. But I know that if anyone were to go, say, for object study at the Clark Atlanta Museum or at the Spelman College Museum, or even at the High Museum for that matter, there would be a conversation about conservation. Many of our objects are in need of treatment. And so those conversations are definitely had. Yes. So can you tell me, like, in terms of the next 30 minutes, because I unfortunately have a thesis meeting to go to with our first class of senior thesis students,
totally.
which unfortunately was scheduled at the very same time as our talk. So I told them I was going to try to at least come in at the last 30 minutes.
Okay.
And
let me just check with our organizer. So we're going to be going into our break at the moment, so that is fine. I can let everybody know that you've had to pop out, but thank you so much.
Okay. And are you able to send us a recording, please?
Yes, this is going out live on YouTube, so the YouTube video will be there.
All right, and you'll send us a link to that?
Absolutely.
Okay. And if I can drop back in, I'll do that.
That would be amazing.
So I might just like leave myself as a
participant
on, and as a participant, and if I can jump back in if there are any other questions to answer. I hope it's what you wanted, Ellie.
It's brilliant.
And I'd be happy to talk to anyone else about the work that we're doing and the program that we have, and just other ideas. I think for me, the idea is about, really trying to infuse these institutions with new blood, but also just to new frameworks of thinking about what is valuable anymore. What do people really think is important? And so we're really trying to ask a lot of these hard questions. And by teaching classes like the art market or like decolonizing the museum, we're really able to, I think, try to get there.
I thought what you were talking about with the metalwork, that the wrought iron beside, I thought that was absolutely brilliant, because sort of in that same sort of framework, had an experience this week where they were talking about whether something was or wasn't a slave collar. And I just thought to myself, okay, well, there's ways of approaching this. And then it was also sort of, oh, well, is it? Well, isn't it? But I thought that that example and the fact that it's from like 1992 just shows that there is already this evidence there for different ways of thinking about all of these things. So I do wonder whether it's the ideas or whether it is that we need new blood and the sort of willingness to just do it and make that practice normal.
Right, right. And also to, like, you know, as we were, I think, in the tail end talking about, is like really, you know, really try to understand why these certain things have been collected, why objects have been collected, whether it's a, you know, a material object or a painting, a work of art. I think those questions are really foundational, especially when we look at the fact that, you know, as we were discussing, many of these institutions, in the end, they don't have the square footage to exhibit them, right? They don't have the ability to put them on view on a regular basis. And then the rules around, oh, well, it's a work on paper or a photograph. And so you can't have, you know, that many lumens and it's going to disintegrate, what have you, you know? So I just think really thinking about, especially, you know, I think it's a disservice to the artists. It's a disservice to the patrons and visitors when you have so much, but you can't share it, and you can't make it available for people to see, to learn from, to study.
Yes, and we'll definitely build on that conversation, hopefully at a later date. So what's going to happen right now is people keep on filtering back in from the breakout spaces. Going to say bye to Dr. Cheryl for a moment, and go for a break, take a moment, take a breather, and then we will be coming back in about 10-15 minutes. Yeah, 10 minutes. Okay, I hope everyone's enjoyed their break and taken a moment. So we're going to start filtering back in and sharing the outcomes that we've discussed. I'm just going to take a moment. Are you sure? Okay, so I'm just going to share a little bit about the solutions that came out of our main room discussion with Dr. Cheryl and Dr. Errol. A few of the points were the need for empathy within all the levels of the museum staff, especially when they're talking about collections. And another really interesting point was imagining the museum without objects and not centering objects anymore, but people's other senses and using the space to reconnect people in that way. Another, as you may have heard before you went into the breakout room, was looking at the collections from more of a artistic point of view. So both the artistic and the academic together, but really viewing it differently and presenting it as such. So those are some of the solutions that came out around tackling the systemic racism and the violence of the collections. So I'm now going to go to Siobhan so we can hear what came out of your breakout room.
Hi, yeah. Think about consciousness in terms of our suggestions to provide solutions. So I would try not to regurgitate anything that's said. So out of all the kind of ideas we had in our first breakout room, we opted to kind of focus on increasing access to training, to jobs, as well as to communities. So broadening and widening different communities. So one of the points that we have been addressing the ethos of organizations. So recognizing that many cultural organizations within the heritage sector cannot remain apolitical. And another point that solution that we had was being bolder, having a little bit more conviction and having a bit more compassion. So that goes hand in hand with your point that came out of the main room about empathy. Another point that we had questioning boards and protocols and systems within and structures within the organization in particular. And I guess reviewing the makeup of the board and seeing if that reflects the audiences that the organization is aiming to attract. Another point we had, which I think will resonate with many people, is valuing the communities financially, valuing more of a diverse workforce financially, and artists as well. Also considering who the organization attracts in terms of branding, tone, approach. More programming and timelines. I'm sure many of us are familiar with a kind of a snail's pace race of being diverse and theories around that, and then recruitment as well. So creating more access and recruitment, and I think that will also counteract a lot of white fragility as well, because with a diverse workforce, there's a lot more diversity of thought. So that was what came out of our breakout room. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're now going to go to Denise.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Great. So one point, or many actually, because my group had so many great points, obviously, as most of us did. So due to the lack of faith in the infrastructure with like boards and board members, presidents, recruitment, as well as kind of seeing the institutions overtly like disconnect themselves from actually actively making changes and kind of ways in which to provide solutions for specifically kind of the current climate of the BLM movement. we were discussing ways in which to display outside of these spaces, so in a way going rogue, and if we can provide neutral spaces to kind of, remove ourselves actually physically from these institutions, and thinking about how feasible that could be. One lady, Elizabeth, hi, she's somewhere around here, she gave an example of reparation in regards to Native American communities and their items, and that kind of demonstrates the success of institutions actively engaging with those that inherently these are their items, and it's culturally meant to be for them, and having that connection is really important and is successful, and there's potential to do that as well. We also discussed the role of educators like Errol and Dr. Findlay, and the importance of them in kind of growing the next generation of non-conformist kind of thinkers who are going to hopefully go up into working into these institutional spaces. Again, with connecting with communities, get the acceptance and approvals of tribal councils and chiefs, and also have them involved in the curatorial process of artifacts and items that were stolen. Again, with recruitment as well, specifically with HR, providing training that is non-biased and doesn't, in terms of the application process, doesn't demonstrate bias and microaggressions. And directing and actively directing applications to socially conscious individuals and groups. Intervention in schools. So again, kind of with educators, having speakers and talks and workshops at a young age to kind of open the sector up, and especially with kind of lower income or minority communities or areas, to really open their eyes to, the sector, exactly, of getting in. And actively scouting for artists and individuals who are unheard or marginalized as well. So institutions, not just saying something, but actually doing something about that. Also unification as well, and that's important and helpful. And ways in which we can support those in non-neutral white spaces. So one solution would be having a community of mentors to help them kind of navigate the infrastructure when they're in these spaces that they cannot really connect with the individuals, or they don't speak like them, or they don't kind of have common, I don't know.
No, I understand what you mean. Common ground,
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, those are some of our points.
I mean, guys, just
thanks for my group.
Sold everything.
Yeah, somehow.
That's brilliant. So I'm now gonna go to Lynn, and we're running a bit low on time, so if we can keep the points short. So we're gonna go to Lynn. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think our group really focused on sort of community-based approaches. So for example, one of our participants works for the National Trust Foundation, and they were doing a project with Penryn Castle where they asked the community to sort of recolonize this castle that had been owned by sort of people with slave owner histories, and asked the community who was against this what they wanted from this castle, what they wanted this castle to be, and started working with contemporary artists. So just bringing in local people. So kind of going around the same, along the same point, we also talked about reaching out to organizations that already were telling stories or deeply involved within the community, so there wasn't so much of an overhead. And something else we talked about was Instagram, and how there are sort of these overflows of people who need to tell their stories and can't get it to be seen in museums. So just looking to those very like vernacular, organic sources. And yeah, just sort of touching on what everyone else had said, not centering the object. And then also, something else was maybe looking towards public funding instead of donor funding, because the donor funding creates a context, creates a vision that is catered towards these very elite groups, which are typically of a certain demographic. So yeah, those were sort of the main ideas that we had for this.
Thank you so much. Next we have Celine.
Yeah, our group had a lot of really great things to say. And we also talked a little bit about the money, but also not just changing it to be public sources, but also potentially government sources of funding. Obviously, this requires a lot more change, but definitely paying attention to where the money comes from and getting away from donors that support things like oil fracking and tear gas, as we saw, tear gas production. Another thing we talked about also was having business or economics be a part of the education for cultural heritage workers, since this is such a big part of the field, and understanding where the money comes from, but also how it's used and what happens to it, the way it works in the field, something that's quite important. We talked about the importance of having tactile exhibits, something that really gets visitors even more so engaged, and kind of breaking that barrier, so there are only certain people that are allowed to touch objects, which is true, but giving visitors something else to really be able to engage with on a much deeper level. We talked about how heritage workers should absolutely take as much responsibility as they can for all of these things and recognize their roles within the system. And so talking about how the hashtag museums are not neutral, and really focusing on all the aspects of education that museums put out. So not only who is the target audience, but who is coming up with the education, who's coming up with the tours that are taught, what is the narrative that's being shown. So education in all of its forms. So I tried to keep it brief. I think I touched on a lot of our points from our room. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think we've got the last two, Ed and Arm. Perfect. Edna, go.
I guess the main thing we were talking about was connections. So whether it's connections with the countries where I think the example given was the African Museum in Belgium and the project they did with Congo recently. And connecting with grassroots organizations, charities, or even just groups led by people who represent the communities whose histories we're talking about. I guess we were just talking about how we're going to dismantle systemic racism in this industry would be just really engaging with people, engaging with communities. And I guess we were also talking about how we could ensure that these connections just aren't like short term. So thinking of not just like one-off events during Black History Month, for example, but actually ensuring that these are like sustainable and long lasting. So I guess we also discussed about making use of the digital climate that this current situation has kind of fostered. So whether it's more, forums like this, or like, more digital events in the future where people, on an international scale could like collaborate and connect and engage with each other. So I think that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that sounds like some really great suggestions. And lastly, but not least, we have Morgan.
Hi, so yeah, I think most of what we talked about has been covered, but we focus specifically on the kind of one-dimensional and lack of different perspectives. So everyone's already talked about how that links to the workforce and obviously needing to diversify workforces. But we talked about in the short term how museums can share staff and expertise, especially large museums that might have more resources, using their resources to help out grassroots and smaller museums. And then also with bringing in different community groups and curators, making sure that they are paid, especially for the emotional labour of interpreting violent histories, so that it's ethical employment. And then we kind of talked about the utopian version of this would be a kind of global exchange of travelling collective of curators and artists, so that people from these countries are where the objects were from are kind of switching and sharing perspectives and skills. And yeah, we also talked about deprivatization of museums so that there's consistent government funding or international funding, which is obviously quite far off and utopian, but yeah.
That is absolutely amazing. Thank you all so much for the conclusions and sharing. So without waffling on anymore, I'm gonna start to wrap up. So I'd like to thank our panelists. I'd like to first start off with thanking our panelists, Dr. Errol Francis and Dr. Cheryl Finley, for their brilliant contribution. Thank you all for your participation, the participants on Zoom, on YouTube, our moderators, our tech team. Thank you all for attending, participating and sharing in this discussion. We'll be sending out feedback forms in about a week's time and kindly fill them out. We hope that you'll all join us again in our future forums. The next one is coming up in December 2020. And we encourage you to maintain connection and stay in touch to action these amazing solutions into 2021. So yeah, thank you everyone.